Our next speaker, our last speaker, is Dr. Rodney Andrews. Uh, Dr. Andrews is a Senior Associate Vice President for Research Administration and Central Services and a Professor of Chemical Engineering in the Stanley and Karen Pigman College of Engineering at UK, with a joint appointment in Mechanical Engineering. He has served as the Director of the Center of Applied Energy Research since 2007, and he co-directs the Energy Research Priority Area. Dr. Andrews also has served on the EPA's Science Advisory Board and the National Coal Council. He is chair of the executive committee of the American Carbon Society and is on the editorial board for the journal Carbon. He's also program director of the Kentucky NSF established program to stimulate competitive research, a statewide initiative to increase research capacity within the Commonwealth. Please welcome Dr. Rodney Andrews. Let me get
That was a little over the top. So I get to do the relatively fun part of this, which is actually presenting what are these new technologies we're talking about. But I'll begin with what are the existing technologies. This is the picture of units, Plant Vogel's units 1 through 4. In the background, you see units 3 and 4. Those are the two most recent nuclear power plants to come online in Kentucky. They are AP1000 plants, meaning they produce 1,000 megawatts each. They were also among the most expensive and the most delayed plants ever built in the United States. But they are up and running at this point. I want my Mac back. How do I get it to go down?
Sorry. Oh, just click. Sorry.
Which click?
Here, right?
The middle button?
Yeah. Oh no, just the left button.
All right, I thought I did that.
Oh.
This is actually a companion slide to the one that Charles put up earlier about reactors and stuff. This is just worldwide. This is from International Atomic Energy Agency, which is the sort of international parent over nuclear energy issues. And what you can see, North America, primarily the US, but Canada has also been very active, has fairly large activity with nuclear production. The one that has been growing very, very rapidly is Southeast Asia and China. And that's just trying to meet their demand for power. They made the decision to move away from building more coal plants. They don't have the natural gas access. And so they've been building nuclear very quickly. And then sort of down on the side there, you can see that Sankey diagram. And that nuclear isn't all used for electricity production. There are other reasons that we do it. One of which was mentioned earlier is medical isotopes. That's a very large use. About 377 reactors, or 417 reactors, sorry, about 377 gigawatt electric capacity worldwide. 90 some of those are in the United States. This shows you what it looks like in terms of both the number of reactors and the net electric capacity for different countries around the world. The one you hear the most about is France, in that they made the decision to use nuclear as their primary power source. And so for the countryside, they have a very large percentage of their electricity produced from nuclear, about 70%. But in total, for number of reactors, reactor hours that have been operated, as well as the actual capacity, the United States is by far the largest nuclear country, despite only getting about 20%, 19 to 20% of our power from nuclear. When we look at the U.S., you can see if we're looking at, and you choose to refer to nuclear as clean energy, meaning not the carbon emissions, Nuclear is by far the largest source there. But again, it is a relatively, it's an important component of our overall power generation in the US. You can see that in the graph there, the green. But it also has been steady for a very long time. We have not been building reactors until Vogtle came on, which you're seeing there, the little bit of an expansion again. So we do have an aging nuclear fleet. That is also why there's a great deal of interest in where do we go. And finally, down there at the bottom, uh, among the realistic generating sources for power, what you can see is that under current operating conditions, so where we are today, nuclear by far has the most uptime. You never turn a plant down if you can help it. So they run at about over 90% utilization factor. With our current activity, particularly with the price of natural gas, coal is actually down below 50% utilization. And that really is just because it's being switched back and forth with gas. So when we're talking about hyperscalers, data centers, those things that have these very, very large load requirements, but need very, very high reliability, nuclear is appealing. And in many cases, those companies are looking at where do they locate. And one of the considerations is, all right, you're on natural gas or you're on coal now, but can you move to nuclear within a decade? So that meets their goals in terms of the sorts of generation they want. I'm just going to hit this very quickly, which is how does a nuclear reactor work? I'm sure most people in the room know this fundamental, which is that you take a neutron and slam it into uranium-235. You get you get two fission products out of that, and you get more neutrons. And the reason that that's matters when we're talking about this is it is that 1 in and 3 out that is what allows it to propagate. Why do we care about this? Well, when you have that reaction, when a neutron is generated and it splits a uranium-235 atom, there is something called the mass defect that occurs. And this is the E equals MC squared proved in real life, which is the products coming out have less mass than the product than what you started with. And in our world, that means that it had to have been converted to energy. And that is what we are recovering and using then to convert that to usable power. And the reason this is appealing, if you're looking at how do we produce power, is that the decay of a single uranium-235 atom replaces about 200 million electron volts of energy. That doesn't seem like, okay, not a huge thing, but there are, billions of uranium atoms in a pound of uranium, particularly if it's been enriched. So that a pound of enriched uranium, in this case, 5% enrichment of 235, is equal to about 1 million gallons of gasoline. That's also, as it mentions here, why nuclear became very appealing for use in naval vessels, things that you want to go a long time without refueling. So, as I mentioned, this is propagation. It's simply as one neutron goes in and splits an atom and you get multiple neutrons out, they then go on to split atoms, and that's how we carry on. Controlling that propagation is how we produce power with a nuclear power reactor, but that control is what we have to make sure we contain, right? That's why reactors are designed the way they are. If the propagation occurs in an uncontrolled manner, that's what we refer to as a meltdown that we want to avoid. And so a lot of the designs and the way reactors work are based around how do we carefully control this in a way that we get propagation so that the reaction continues and we continue to produce power at a reliable rate, but do so under tightly controlled conditions. So a little bit about operating reactors. These were mentioned as light water reactors. In the US, we have two types of nuclear reactors right now in production scale. They're both called light water, meaning they just use normal H2O as their coolant. This is the boiling water reactor. The reason it's referred to as that is that the water is the working fluid as well. So it is directly in contact with the reactor core. As it goes through that core, which obviously is hot, it will boil and produce steam. That steam then goes off and goes through a power cycle through a turbine. That is, at that point, that's absolutely the same as every other thermal power plant that we operate. You made steam, we know how to turn steam into electricity. But in this case, that steam is generated by direct contact with the reactor core. The pressurized water reactor, which is actually the more common design, it has two separate cycles. And so the water that serves as the coolant goes through the core, and then it's under pressure so that it doesn't boil. And that allows it then to go to a steam generator where it is contacted with a separate steam cycle that water then does not have direct contact with the reactor core. And there are some advantages to that in terms of how you manage and also how you control the system. The pressurizer being, the big part of that to keep it from boiling. So we've mentioned SMRs and new nuclear several times. I'll spend basically the rest of my talk going through what these are and why we're looking at them as technologies that can be possibilities for how we might produce power in the future, looking at using fission reactors. So these are often referred to as Generation 4 reactors. That's actually a distinction IAEA makes. And it's just because of the way that when we're looking at development, they're defined that way. And so these are a lot of iterations on the boiling water and the pressurized water reactors, but also looking at different coolant fluids, looking at different contact methods for transferring heat. In this case, this is a supercritical water-cooled reactor. So we had the pressurized water reactor where we kept the water from boiling. We kept it under pressure to prevent that. In a supercritical water-cooled reactor, we do the opposite. We allow the water to go into a supercritical phase. That then goes through and is what is used as the fluid to expand in the turbine and produce power. You can then have secondary heat recovery off of that. That can either be going for coolant or that can be being used for like district heating or process heat, which is one of the reasons these are appealing. And I've got the reference here. If you're interested in that, that is a really, really good report that was done by the Congressional Research Service that covers a lot of the aspects of the Gen 4 reactors. Why would you want to go to a supercritical reactor? Well, because that fluid carries more energy. It has a greater energy density for the amount of fluid that you're moving around. And so it allows you to increase the efficiency of the plant. This is a very high temperature prismatic reactor. These are not really considered for straight power production. These reactors are of interest for heat production and use in this case, I'm showing it as looking at it for doing hydrogen production from a halide cycle. So hydrogen iodide, you split it, you re-react it, and you're able to produce hydrogen in fairly simple and straightforward process. But you need a source of high quality, high temperature heat. And so in this case, You can see, but this kind of shows where I was mentioning about controlling that propagation rate. You're using here, we're just showing multiple control rods going in. The core is actually designed in a prismatic way so that the control rods are in a fixed pattern as they come down. And here, using a graphite reactor, the reason you use a graphite is it can operate at much higher temperatures than other materials, has an extremely high heat transport rate, and it has a negative coefficient of thermal expansion. That's an issue with materials and anything operating at high temperature. If you're using a metal, it expands, and therefore you have expansion, contraction. You don't want that. Graphite is negative, so it actually won't move around. And so there's that design, and here they're using helium simply because of the temperature that it's operating. Helium is very stable. Using something like nitrogen, you would have issues with ionization. And there's a whole history around graphite, nuclear graphite, and its use in reactors. Some very positive, and some less so, like Chernobyl. All right. There we go. This is the gas-cooled fast reactor. This is one that is very interesting in terms of how efficient it can be. And here it's just shown as, again, using a helium coolant, but it's going through, in this case, it's set up as a multiple stage system. So you're bringing the helium out at very high temperature, putting it through a primary turbine, and then you're using your recuperator to pull out more heat, which can then go through additional phases. And while it's doing that, it's actually also then using that byproduct as a way of recompressing the helium back through the system. So this is gives you a little bit of a bigger idea of what that kind of system might look like. These are operated as a fast reactor, meaning they're operated at a higher flux. So they're putting heat out at a faster rate. But you are also controlling that by how large the reactor core is. These two are some that are really interesting right now, a lot of interest in them. And that is because these are different sorts of sodium-cooled reactors. So here we're using a metal that has a fairly low melting point. It is, being a metal, has very high heat conduction, has very high heat capacity. And so really the ideas here are that with the using primary sodium there, as it goes through the core and it gets hot, it expands, and it has, it lower density. So it will go up and around, and you can use natural circulation or assisted natural circulation as the way of cycling that the coolant around that way. And then you effectively use either a primary or a secondary heat transfer loop to pull the power out of that reactor. Sodium-cooled reactors get a lot of attention. Obviously, these also require a great deal of safety concerns. Not only are you operating at criticality, you're using a pyrophoric metal at very high temperatures to do that. So these systems have to, the safety systems on these are quite extensive. The kind of flip side of that is if the reactor has an issue, you can let the metal solidify and it will freeze that reactor. So there's that's sort of a trade-off there with the way that technology has been developed. I think they're probably, one of the more complicated. This is another one. Somebody kind of took the lithium-cooled reactors a step further, and this is actually using a lead coolant. And so here again, you're able to take advantage of just the natural transport within the reactor. So you have lead metal. As it's exposed to the reactor core, it heats. It becomes less dense. It starts expanding. So you go up and then you get natural circulation. As it goes to the top, it goes through heat exchange modules. Those are what are the working loop out to the turbine. But as it does that, it cools, becomes denser, sinks back down. An upside here is lead is an incredibly useful shielding material. It's what we use as a primary shield on a lot of radiation sources. So you kind of have your reactor core surrounded by a shield itself, and you're just transporting the heat around in that case. Again, one of the stated benefits of this is, again, you can just freeze the reactor. It'll be encased in lead. This is the molten salt reactor with the SMRs that were talked about. Some of those are based around molten salt systems as the coolant and heat transfer. They're not all this design. This is just happens to be one schematic. But effectively, you have sort of the prismatic core again, and you are using a molten salt, salt above its melting point, as your transport fluid. High thermal conductivity, high heat capacity. And there are a couple other advantages. One, you can also have a secondary loop here where you store large amounts of salt at temperature. And so that allows you to maintain temperature over time, regardless sort of where you're operating the reactor at. So you can load follow a little bit better with that. Also, again, this has the built-in feature of you can freeze the core. You can let the salt freeze. It will encapsulate everything. Generally, you would have this, and then this would be stuck at the bottom of a pool because water, again, is a great shield for radiation. So these have a lot of attention right now because you can have small, intense-sized systems. But again, these are more complicated. You're working with something that's corrosive. We know how to solve that through material science, but it's also one where we talked about education quite a bit. We need the people who know how to operate with those kinds of materials, especially welding, especially processing, those sorts of things. But these have been, shown. There's a couple systems that have, without using a critical core, have shown the salt system working. Have proven out all of their design in terms of the circulation and storage and all of that. So this is a fairly advanced into the you might be able to order one kind of category. So when we talk about small modular reactors, these tend to be taking those Gen 4 reactors and turning them into what are we going to do with them? The reasons that are given for why you want to do this. Small, cheaper, safer, distributable. They just announced that they're probably going to put a reactor at Fort Campbell because it's small, it can power the base, those sorts of things. The cheaper part of this right now, we're all dealing with N=1 in terms of our experience in making these reactors. So there's not really a possibility of cheaper until we get to N higher than that. But the reason they're called modular is because the entire idea of this is that they can be manufactured. So instead of like Vogel, where it had to be built at site, these are smaller. They're going to be 200 megawatt, 250 megawatt. And so they can be built in a factory where you're doing multiples of them. And then they're transported to your site and placed rather than having to go through all of the building steps and NRC review for construction. As long as you build these exactly the same every time, you don't have to go back through an engineering review for every single one. Distributable, does have the advantage of smaller site requirements, putting them possibly in communities that don't really have reliable power. There's a lot of interest in that, with places like Alaska or some of the outlying island territories. But when you talk about doing this for, a large utility scale system, you're going to have 3 or 4 of these together to get you back to the gigawatt scale. These are just some examples of sort of where things are at. The top one there is the new scale power reactors, and you're seeing multiple cores there. This isn't a coolant bath. And so it's not showing all the downstream stuff, but you get the idea. It's sort of a containerized reactor. BWRX 300, very similar sort of in the physical construction, different operating principles there. But again, sort of containerized systems that you bring to the site and set in place. And then just this is the new scale. The Utah Municipal Power Systems, as well as Idaho National Lab, have a program with them to look at bringing on one of their small modular reactors. UAMP would buy the power. Idaho National Lab would use it as part of their development system, and it would allow NuScale to do their first of a kind installation. There are a lot of these. I think the last time I was at a talk, and one of the folks there who's head of nuclear for one of the really large utilities made the comment that there are about 120 different designs floating around right now. My opinion is that is rapidly going to go down to 4 or 5. The first ones out, and the ones that can deliver on the modular and safer will get there. But natrium reactor, sodium cooled fast reactor with molten salt transfer. So that's, one of the very out there. I think that's what Abilene Christian is looking at doing for their new reactor. X Energy high temperature gas reactor. This one is interesting to me because you're looking at both being able to produce power with it, but also, since it's a high temperature gas reactor, it can have secondary use for process heat to do things again like hydrogen production or CO2 conversion. And then there are a whole bunch more. Eventually, when you get there, you're starting to talk about micro reactors, things that are 25 megawatts or smaller. A lot of these are like 10 megawatt, and it's again designed for specific applications in areas where either you want a redundant or your own power source, or there's just not anything else available. And so there are a whole bunch of different versions of these. Office of Nuclear Energy has a lot of information if you're looking at which ones are there. When we talk about the advanced reactors, again, we don't have any of these in commercial operation. These are all where we're looking at doing demonstrations. You've got a number of sites. Most of them are either national lab facilities or are existing plants. The first sort of commercial SMR will be TVA at Clinch River. They're the first generating utility that will do that. But you can see Idaho at the national lab there, which is the nuclear energy lab for the Department of Energy. They're running a whole series of different sorts of reactors. They did, when you were mentioning that about restarting, Idaho did restart one of their reactors. Now, it's a small reactor. It's not 3 Mile Island, but they have successfully brought a reactor back up online. But it's also in an experimental setting. I just want to real quickly mention fuel supply. One of the things about these advanced reactors and the small modulars is that they do use different sorts of fuel than an AP1000. When we talk about fuel and uranium, natural uranium's about 0.7% U-235. So traditional commercial reactors use fuel that's been enriched to about 3 to 5%. There is very little U-235 in your fuel, and then after you use it through the fuel cycle, almost all of that is still in that fuel. So that's why reprocessing comes in. When we talk about what we're going to use in these more advanced reactor designs, it's what we refer to as HALEU fuel. So you've got low enriched uranium, which is what's used now. The advanced low enriched uranium just means you're at that 5%, a little bit higher point. Mostly for the newer small modular advanced reactors, we're talking about using what's called HALEU, which is high assay low enriched uranium. And high assay means it's got a higher percentage of U-235 in it, up to about 20%. And most of those reactor designs want to be up around that 20%. Sort of an upside for that is it means you refuel much less frequently. You can set the core and you won't have to do refueling for a longer period of time. You do have more of 235 present, though. And then, when we're talking about highly enriched uranium, that's what's used in naval vessels. That's not that's not in commercial use. That's not public. And that may be all the way up to 90%. So we do know how to do really, really highly enrichment. It's just not something we're going to use in commercial plant. Sort of the other part of this has been a lot of development that's gone on in fuel design. So TRISO is one that there are a number of those reactors kind of designed around using. And that is, it's fully ceramic encased. It's actually multiple layers of ceramic. And the basis of that design, you have your uranium pellet encased like that, and these are very small. And that, like you can see there, the cross section, they're like a millimeter in diameter. They're very small. They're then mixed with a binder, which is then made into these slugs. Those slugs then are what get stacked up in a fuel rod. The reason TRISO is really being looked at as kind of the basis is they've actually designed that so that the amount of energy contained within that uranium cannot produce enough heat to melt the ceramic. So in the past, you've had problems where if a reactor ran away and it overheated, it would slag the fuel slugs. And so you would get an increasing concentration of uranium. It's hot, it's going to start propagating, and therefore you get that runaway type heat. Even if you bring it under control, you've had radiation, right? TRISO is very much designed around that. It's that they've designed the ceramic layers with the materials that there's not enough energy in that single little tiny bit of uranium to be able to melt that ceramic. And so it's sort of a natural containment. Again, there's not a commercial manufacturer of this yet. So this is also going along with, as people are talking about building SMRs and bringing them online, we also have some of the fuel processors who've now gotten funding from the Department of Energy to begin producing, a limited quantity of TRISO so that they can be used in these reactors in first of a kind. And everybody already covered this, so I'll just stop. This is general laser enrichment and general matter. They are, both getting underway. They were both included within DOE's call for the production of HALEU fuel. So they picked 6 companies, and it's a $2 billion purchase order for whoever's going to deliver first or second will probably be the one who gets most of that. And again, that's really targeted at developing the supply chain to supply the Gen 4 reactor designs with fuel. So that's it.
Thank you.
You now know everything you need to know about Gen 4 reactors.